Form 5 of lightsaber combat, known as Shien or Djem So, depending on the style, was popular among the Jedi Order's most gifted Jedi Guardians, among them Plo Koon, Aayla Secura, and Adi Gallia. But perhaps the most well-known user of this form was Anakin Skywalker, one of the most gifted and formidable Jedi Knights of his time, and later one of the most feared Sith Lords. Anakin's mastery of this form of lightsaber combat was a significant part of what made him one of the Clone Wars' most feared combatants, but it also played a significant role in driving the young Jedi to the dark side. Form 5 itself wasn't the cause of Anakin's fall, and we've already discussed the true cause in depth in another video if you're interested. However, it was an enabler, making it easier for Anakin to make the choices that ultimately damned him. In this video, we'll be examining why Djem So was one of Anakin Skywalker's greatest strengths and an overlooked contributing factor in his fall to the dark side. As a quick note before we begin, we're once again going to be extensively drawing from Matthew Stover's novelization of Revenge of the Sith today, along with the source book The Jedi Path by Daniel Wallace. As always, we encourage you to buy these books and support their authors, and with that out of the way, let's get into things.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Anakin Skywalker was a complicated man, and the nuances of his character ended up having a disproportionately huge impact on the history of the galaxy. During the Clone Wars, Anakin Skywalker, alongside his former master Obi-Wan Kenobi, was the Republic's most revered war hero. To the loyalist public, he embodied all the fantastical heroism traditionally associated with the Jedi Knights. He was a legend made real, a Knight of the Republic leading the clone army to victory after victory, often against staggering odds. To the Jedi Council, he was a constant source of frustration, but one who often managed to solve unsolvable problems anyway. To the most important people in his life, from Obi-Wan to Padme Amidala to R2-D2, he was many things, but above all, he was a good and fiercely loyal man. But all of them, save maybe Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, failed to see what truly defined and motivated Anakin Skywalker. An inner darkness born of deep fear, which tormented Anakin until it pushed him over the edge. To quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization, "This is Anakin Skywalker, the most powerful Jedi of his generation, perhaps any generation, the fastest, the strongest, an unbeatable pilot, an unstoppable warrior. On the ground, in the air, or sea or space, there is no one even close. He has not just power, not just skill, but dash. That rare, invaluable combination of boldness and grace. He is the best there is at what he does, the best there's ever been, and he knows it. HoloNet features call him the hero with no fear, and why not? What should he be afraid of? Except, fear lives inside him anyway, chewing away the firewalls around his heart. This was something that the Jedi Council first noticed back when Anakin was first introduced to them by Qui-Gon Jinn. They had hoped that Jedi training would help him overcome his fear, but Anakin never actually dealt with it. He just buried it deep in his heart. For a decade, he had more or less been able to keep it down, but emotional repression is always doomed to failure, and Anakin's fear came back with a vengeance amidst tragedies in his personal life and the outbreak of the Clone Wars. The core of Anakin's fear was very simple. He was terrified of losing the ones he cared about. But it went deeper than that. To quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization again, Anakin sometimes thinks of the dread that eats at his heart as a dragon. Children on Tatooine tell each other of the dragons that live inside the suns. Smaller cousins of the sun dragons that are supposed to live inside the fusion furnaces that power everything from starships to pod races. But Anakin's fear is another kind of dragon. A cold kind, a dead kind. Not nearly dead enough. Not long after he became Obi-Wan's Padawan, all those years ago, A minor mission had brought them to a dead system, one so immeasurably old that its star had long ago turned to a frigid dwarf of hypercompacted trace metals, hovering a quantum fraction of a degree above absolute zero. Anakin couldn't even remember what the mission might have been, but he'd never forgotten that dead star. It had scared him. Stars can die? It is the way of the universe, which is another manner of saying that it is the will of the Force, Obi-Wan had told him. Everything dies. In time, even stars burn out. This is why Jedi form no attachments. All things pass. To hold on to something, or someone, beyond its time, is to set your selfish desires against the Force. That is a path of misery, Anakin. The Jedi do not walk it. That is the kind of fear that lives inside Anakin Skywalker, the dragon of that dead star. It is an ancient, cold, dead voice within his heart that whispers, all things die. Anakin wasn't just afraid of loss, he was terrified of its inevitability. What really scared him wasn't that someone he cared about might die, but that they would die. This was a cold, harsh, inescapable reality that Anakin was completely unable to accept or live with, and because of that, he lived in constant torment. The events of 22 BBY and the Clone Wars only made this worse. The death of his mother was the realization of Anakin's worst fears, and the Clone Wars threatened to kill many others he cared about. Incidents like Ahsoka Tano leaving the Jedi Order behind and the Jedi Council faking Obi-Wan's death and leaving him out of the loop only worsened Anakin's terror. By the end of the Clone Wars, while Anakin might have seemed to be a perfectly stable person, even an exemplary Jedi, he was nearing a breaking point internally. To quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization again, "In bright day, he can't hear it. Battle, a mission, even a report before the Jedi Council can make him forget it's even there. But at night, the walls he has built sometimes start to frost over. Sometimes they start to crack. At night, the Dead Star Dragon sometimes sneaks through the cracks and crawls up into his brain and chews at the inside of his skull. The dragon whispers of what Anakin has lost and what he will lose. The dragon reminds him, every night, of how he held his dying mother in his arms, of how she had spent her last strength to say, "I knew you would come for me, Anakin." The dragon reminds him, every night, that someday he will lose Obi-Wan, he will lose Padme, or they will lose him. All things die, Anakin Skywalker. Even the stars burn out. And the only answer he ever has for these dead cold whispers are his memories of Obi-Wan's voice or Yoda's. But sometimes he can't quite remember them. This constant terror was what defined Anakin Skywalker. More to the point, it was what kept him constantly motivated. It was why he had the will to pull off all those crazy, improbable victories, why he was never willing to give up on anything, why he was constantly pushing himself to improve and do better. Anakin's fear was what drove him to become the best pilot in the galaxy, a natural leader, a cunning tactician, a devastating fighter, and all the other things. Above all else, Anakin wanted to be able to save the ones he cared about, to not have to lose anyone ever again, and to his mind, that meant he needed to be powerful, to be able to do the impossible without breaking a sweat. He spent the Clone Wars defying the odds and avoiding the seemingly inevitable in the hope that he could become good enough to overcome the most certain thing in the universe. But these efforts actually only made his fear worse because he knew that it might not be enough. To again quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization, "Now the Supreme Chancellor is in the worst kind of danger, and Anakin is on his way despite the dread boiling through his blood." That's what makes him a real hero. Not the way the HoloNet labels him, not without fear, but stronger than fear. He looks the dragon in the eye and doesn't even slow down. If anyone can save Palpatine, Anakin will. Because he's already the best, and he's still getting better. But locked away behind the walls of his heart, the dragon that is his fear coils and squirms and hisses. Because his real fear, in a universe where even stars can die, is that being the best will never be quite good enough. This, believe it or not, is where Form 5 comes in. Anakin chose to focus on mastering Djem So after the Battle of Geonosis, and he didn't make that choice on a whim. It was a response to the outcome of his duel with Count Dooku, in which he did his best, yet still lost. That defeat was a stinging reminder that his best might not always be good enough, and it made Anakin determined that he would never be beaten like that again. He chose Djem So because he believed it gave him a good chance of this. For one, it was almost a direct counter to Count Dooku's preferred form, Wakashi, and for another, it was the lightsaber combat form that focused the most on raw, direct, destructive power. It was, as far as Anakin could see, a quick and easy path to victory in combat, and that gave him the best possible chance of being able to beat the odds and save the day. To understand why, of course, we need to talk about Form 5 in greater depth. Form 5 consisted of two disciplines, Shien and Djem So, and it was also known as the Way of the Krayt Dragon, or the Perseverance form. Developed prior to the old Sith Wars by Surisu practitioners looking for a Form 3 alternative that was less passive and didn't draw out combat that much, Form 5 was originally meant to allow users to create their own opportunities to strike rather than waiting for one to arise. The result was Shien, which combined solid defense with a strong offense, and which emphasized using an opponent's attack against them, such as by redirecting a blaster bolt back toward its target, or by following up defensive maneuvers with counterstrikes. Form 5 essentially combined the strong defense of Form 3 with the more aggressive tactics of Form 2. It encouraged its users to dominate combat, to fight aggressively so as to overpower their opponent, quickly and efficiently ending fights. The Jedi cautioned that the aggression of Form 5 needed to be tempered with compassion, and some criticized the aggressive nature of the form as being conducive to the dark side, but Form 5 was nonetheless very common in the Jedi Order. Both disciplines of Form 5 emphasized strength and raw power first and foremost, making them unsuitable for Jedi with weaker physiques and ideal for larger, burlier duelists, especially since Form 5 didn't require nearly as much agility as many other lightsaber combat forms. In practice, the form was characterized by power attacks and by combining a formidable defense with a constant, overwhelming offense, which was designed to keep the opponent constantly off balance and unable to counterattack. Shien, the original Form 5 style, was more of a general combat form, optimized for use against large numbers of blaster-wielding opponents. It retained far more of its Form 3 roots than Djem So did, as Shien still placed substantial emphasis on maintaining a strong defense, though without hampering the user's ability to counterattack. The key to Shien was using defense as offense, mainly by redirecting an enemy's attacks back at them, whether by redirecting a blaster bolt back toward the shooter, or by carrying out an immediate counterattack after parrying an opponent's lightsaber. Shien was the most optimized of all the lightsaber combat forms for deflecting blaster bolts, with many deflection techniques. Among the most notable of these were Barrier of Blades, which saw the duelist respond to a salvo of blaster fire by rapidly redirecting blaster bolts in every direction, and Shien Deflection, in which the duelist deflected an incoming attack and performed their own lunge attack at the same time. Most Shien users, and almost all Djem So users, held their lightsabers two-handed for maximum application of strength, but some Shien users employed one-handed reverse grips, which made it easier to carry out broad, sweeping slashes against groups of opponents. This enhanced Shien's existing specialization for use against multiple opponents, but it accentuated the form's main weakness. Its users often struggled against single opponents. Still, many Shien users, among them Ahsoka Tano, Adi Gallia, and Kazdan Paradis, were able to use the form quite effectively in one-on-one fights. For the most part though, battles against a single opponent, as well as lightsaber dueling in general, was more suited to Form 5's other discipline, Djem So. Djem So was a later variant of Form 5 designed specifically for lightsaber dueling, and it put less emphasis on Shien's defensive techniques and blaster bolt deflection principles, in favor of raw offensive power. While Djem So users could still put up a formidable defense, employing a mix of quick blocks and parries against blaster bolts and melee attacks, this discipline of Form 5 was extremely offense-oriented. Djem So allowed the duelists to leverage their own physical strength to use the force of an opponent's blow against them, follow up parries and blocks with immediate, overwhelming counterattacks, and maintain constant forward motion, backing the opponent into a corner and depriving them of the opportunity to respond, catch their breath, or retake control of the fight. A Djem So master could utterly dominate almost any lightsaber duel, overcoming the masters of more precise and skill-based forms with raw power. Djem So was by far the most physically demanding lightsaber form, requiring extensive natural strength. But if a Jedi met those requirements, the discipline was worth learning, as it allowed them to harness their strength to the fullest. Jedi could even enhance their strength through the Force to produce even more powerful Djem So offenses, which were nearly impossible to defend against. The focus of Djem So was on power attacks, which duelists could use as trump cards to completely and quickly overpower an enemy. Notable ones included Falling Avalanche, an extremely powerful overhead chop, and Fluid Riposte, a parry that transitioned straight into an attack. All told, Djem So was an extremely formidable form, and its sole weakness was its lack of mobility. Djem So was also considered one of the most dangerous lightsaber combat forms by the Jedi, mainly because of its aggression and its focus on raw power. Some Jedi argue that these traits made the combat style more suited to the Sith, as, much like the dark side of the Force, it was a quick, easy, and exceedingly violent path to victory, heavily focused on power and domination. The Sith, for their part, agreed. Many Sith, including Darth Bane, employed a variant of Djem So, which dispensed with what subtlety and defense the form had in favor of sheer power and pure offense. But Djem So was, nonetheless, not a Sith style, and many Jedi used it for a reason. It didn't require Jedi to draw on aggressive emotions or anything like that, and while its movements were aggressive and power-oriented, it could easily be tempered with compassion. The goal of Djem So was to defeat an opponent and to do so efficiently, nothing more, and this was entirely compatible with the Jedi way. But to a Jedi of a certain mindset, the aggression and power-focused nature of Djem So could be dangerous. It could encourage Jedi that were already so inclined to lean into these aspects to feed the power of Djem So with dark emotions. Most dangerously, it was very easy to use Djem So to kill rather than simply subdue. It was these dangers that made Djem So a relevant part of Anakin Skywalker's story. Anakin was, after all, inclined to lean into Djem So's aggression and focus on overwhelming power, for they made him a more formidable opponent, able to crush anyone that threatened him or the ones he cared about. Djem So also offered Anakin obvious direction for improvement. It was a form that grew more effective the more raw power the user had. As a consequence, Anakin grew stronger over the course of the Clone Wars. He became even more fearsome with Djem So until he was one of the most effective lightsaber duelists in the Jedi Order. By the time of the Battle of Coruscant, near the end of the war, Skywalker's skill with the form was such that he was even able to overcome Count Dooku, fulfilling one of the goals he'd set when choosing to study Djem So, as described in the Revenge of the Sith novelization. The first overhand chop of Skywalker's blade slid off Dooku's instinctive guard. The second bent Dooku's wrist. The third flash of blue forced Dooku's scarlet blade so far to the inside that his own lightsaber scorched his shoulder, and Dooku was forced to give ground. Dooku felt himself blanch. Where had this come from? Skywalker came on, mechanically inexorable, impossibly powerful, a destroyer droid with a lightsaber, each step a blow and each blow a step. Dooku backed away as fast as he dared. Skywalker stayed right on top of him. Dooku's breath went short and hard. He no longer tried to block Skywalker's strikes, but only to guide them slanting away. He couldn't meet Skywalker strength to strength. Not only did the boy wield tremendous reserves of Force energy, but his sheer physical power was astonishing. And only then did Dooku understand that he'd been suckered. Skywalker's Shien-ready stance had been a ruse, as had his Ataru gymnastics. The boy was a Djem So stylus, and as fine a one as Dooku had ever seen. His own elegant Makashi simply didn't generate the kinetic power to meet Djem So head to head, especially not while also defending against a second attacker. By this point in the war, Anakin's skill with Djem So was such that almost no single enemy stood a chance of defeating him in single combat. In his obsession with improvement, he had mastered Form 5 using both his own natural strength and additional strength contributed by the Force to make a near unstoppable offense. This was what made him one of the Jedi Order's most effective fighters during the Clone Wars. Not even the Separatists' fearsome Magna Guards or fallen Jedi could stand against his lightsaber skill, and even though Djem So was mainly a dueling form, Anakin was able to use it to devastating effect against entire armies as well. The key to Anakin's success with the form, however, was less skill with Djem So's various maneuvers and more how it allowed him to make use of his strong connection to the Force. Djem So allowed the user to convert power in the Force into raw physical power in combat, and Anakin's strong connection to the Force thus allowed him to employ astonishing strength in lightsaber combat. And in some battles, he was even able to grow stronger as the fight went on, and he drew more heavily on the Force, as also described in the Revenge of the Sith novelization. The shining blue lightsaber whirled and spat, and every overhand chop crashed against Dooku's defense with the unstoppable power of a meteor strike. The Sith Lord spent lavishly of his reserve of the Force merely to meet these attacks without being cut in half. And Skywalker was getting stronger. Each parry cost Dooku more power than it used to throw Kenobi across the room. Each block aged him a decade. But, of course, there was an obvious danger in this. It encouraged Anakin to constantly want ever more power. After all, his ultimate goal was to quell his fears, to be able to keep the people he cared about from dying, and this was an impossible task, one that Anakin could spend his whole life working toward and never accomplish. This would leave him chasing ever greater power endlessly, and that was the way of the Sith. This obviously wasn't just about lightsaber skill alone, but the power-centric nature of Djem So encouraged that sort of thinking to Anakin's eventual misfortune and Count Dooku's. Because that last duel with Count Dooku on the Invisible Hand was Anakin Skywalker's tipping point. It was when he crossed a point of no return, and in large part, it was Djem So that helped guide him there. Indeed, his use of the form had unconsciously led him to the edge of the dark side already, as Count Dooku belatedly realized. To quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization, Skywalker leapt from the balcony. Even as the boy hurtled downward, Dooku felt a new twist in the currents of the Force between them, and he finally understood. He understood how Skywalker was getting stronger, why he no longer spoke, how he had become a machine of battle. He understood why Sidious had been so interested in him for so long. Skywalker was a natural. There was a thermonuclear furnace where his heart should be, and it was burning through the firewalls of his Jedi training. He held the Force in the clench of a white-hot fist. He was half Sith already, and he didn't even know it. This boy had the gift of fury. And even now, he was holding himself back. Even now, as he landed at Dooku's flank and rained blows upon the Sith Lord's defenses, even as he drove Dooku backwards step after step, Dooku could feel how Skywalker kept his fury banked behind walls of will. Walls that were hardened by some uncontrollable dread. Dread, Dooku surmised, of himself. Of what might happen if he should ever allow that furnace he used for a heart to go supercritical. Anakin had unconsciously been using dark emotions, his anger and fear, to fuel his power in the Force, and he had used that to fuel his raw strength for his battle with Dooku. He'd been doing this for a while by this point, but he wasn't even aware he had been doing it. It had come naturally to him as part of his Djem So discipline. But this came perilously close to use of the dark side. Anakin seemed to know that much, and he restrained himself just enough to avoid crossing that line until that day above Coruscant. Then, with the lives of his two closest friends on the line, Anakin Skywalker decided that the time for restraint had ended, and he began consciously using his fury and fear to fuel his command of the Force, to convert them into raw power for use against Dooku. Djem So guided him to open and deliberate use of the dark side, and Anakin used the dark side to fuel Djem So, to dominate his opponent and utterly subdue him. To quote the Revenge of the Sith novelization again, "This is the death of Count Dooku." A starburst of clarity blossoms within Anakin Skywalker's mind when he says to himself, "Oh, I get it now," and discovers that the fear within his heart can be a weapon too. It is that simple and that complex, and it is final. Dooku is dead already. The rest is mere detail. Anakin's head has been filled with the smoke from his smothered heart for far too long. It has been the thunder that darkens his mind. On Argonar, on Jabim, and the Tusken camp on Tatooine, that smoke had clouded his mind, had blinded him and left him flailing in the dark, a mindless machine of slaughter. But here, now, within this ship, this microscopic cell of life in the infinite sterile desert of space, his firewalls have opened so that the terror and rage are out there, in the fight, instead of in his head, and Anakin's mind is clear as a crystal ball. In that pristine clarity, there is only one thing he must do: decide. So he does. He decides to win. He decides that Dooku should lose the same hand he took. Decision is reality here. His blade moves simultaneously with his will, and blue fire vaporizes black Corellian nanosilk and disintegrates flesh and shears bone, and away falls a Sith Lord's lightsaber hand, trailing smoke that tastes of charred meat and burned hair. The hand falls with a bar of scarlet blaze still extending from its spastic death grip, and Anakin's heart sings for the fall of that red blade. He reaches out, and the Force catches it for him. And then Anakin takes Dooku's other hand as well. But the dark side was addictive. Once a Jedi started using it, it constantly pushed them to go further, and with a bit of encouragement from Palpatine, that was exactly what Anakin did. In the rush of victory, under pressure from his closest friend and from the fear that had driven him to this point, he committed a murder in cold blood. Now, of all the steps Anakin made on the path to the dark side, his killing of Count Dooku might not seem like a terribly important one. One might say, as Palpatine did, that he was too dangerous to be left alive anyway, and a quick execution, while harsh, was necessary. But that wasn't why Anakin had done it. He had murdered Dooku out of hatred, and he knew it. It wasn't the first murder he had committed, of course, but those he had killed during the Clone Wars were battlefield casualties, and at least crimes like the slaughter of the Sand People had been committed in a blind rage, and Anakin could tell himself that he hadn't truly been in control. But the murder of Dooku was different. Anakin had made the deliberate choice to kill an unarmed prisoner. It was a choice that haunted him, albeit for a brief while, as described in the Revenge of the Sith novelization. Murderer and murdered each stared blindly, but only the murderer blinked. I did that. The severed head stare was fixed on something beyond living sight. The desperate plea frozen in place on its lips echoed in silence. The headless torso collapsed with a slowly fading sigh from the cauterized gape of its trachea, folding forward at the waist as though making obeisance before the power that had ripped away its life. The murderer blinked again. Who am I? Was he the slave boy on a desert planet, valued for his astonishing gift with machines? Was he the legendary pod racer, the only human to survive that deadly sport? Was he the unruly, high-spirited, trouble-prone student of a great Jedi Master? The star pilot? The hero? The lover? The Jedi? Could he be all these things? Could he be any of them and still have done what he has done? He was already discovering the answer at the same time that he finally realized he needed to ask the question. Djem So brought Anakin Skywalker to this point of no return, and while it wasn't what pushed him over the line, it was still a line that he might have better avoided crossing otherwise. And once he had crossed that line, once he had used his fear and rage as a weapon, once he had used the dark side to fuel his power in combat, and once he had committed murder out of hatred, it was all too easy to keep doing it all, again and again, until the darkness in his heart was all that was left for him. Anakin's fall continued rapidly after the death of Count Dooku. A mere 3 days after the end of the Battle of Coruscant, he betrayed the Jedi Order, apprenticed himself to Darth Sidious, and was named Darth Vader. After becoming a Sith Lord, he continued his study of Djem So, and he continued to fuel the form with his rage and fear, developing an overtly dark-sided variant of it. Similar to the Djem So variant that had been favored by Darth Bane centuries earlier, this take on the style was almost exclusively focused on offense and brute force, converting blind fury into raw killing power. Vader demonstrated this new take on Djem So as early as his fateful duel with Obi-Wan on Mustafar, as described in the Revenge of the Sith novelization. Anakin followed, constantly attacking. Obi-Wan again gave ground, retreating along a narrow balcony high above the black sand shoreline of a lake of fire. Mustafar hummed with death behind his back, only a moment away, somewhere out there among the rivers of molten rock. Obi-Wan let Anakin drive him toward it. It was a place, he decided, they should reach together. Anakin forced him back and back, slamming his blade down with strength that seemed to flow from the volcano overhead. He spun and whirled and sliced razor-sharp shards of steel from the wall and shot them at Obi-Wan with the full heat of his fury. After this duel left Vader with crippling injuries that required cybernetic reconstruction, his style in lightsaber combat changed. He integrated elements of Juyo, Makashi, and other styles into his blade work, but his focus remained on Djem So, with which he was more deliberate, powerful, and slower after his reconstruction. Vader perfected his Sith take on Djem So, using it to great effect against many surviving Jedi. But with all that in mind, it's important to reinforce that Djem So was still not inherently a dark side form. After all, it was Luke Skywalker's preferred style as well. Luke had picked elements of Djem So up by mirroring Vader's movements during their duel on Cloud City, and he had developed the form further in the months that followed. A year later, Luke used Djem So to defeat Vader in a duel aboard the second Death Star, briefly drawing on his fury to fuel it, much as Vader did. But unlike his father, Luke recognized what he was doing here, and he was able to stop himself. He had Vader at his mercy, as Vader had once had Count Dooku, but Luke decided to spare him. He had the compassion and mercy of a true Jedi, and this kept Djem So firmly as a light side style for him. So that's our look at Djem So and Shien, Form 5 of lightsaber combat, and how it enabled Anakin Skywalker's fall to the dark side. But what do you think? Would you like us to analyze any other aspects of Anakin's fall? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.